The aviation industry is seeing big drama, and not the good kind. A major accident is on the horizon. All the symptoms are in plain sight. Mid-air collisions. Airplanes are losing parts in flight. Jets flipping on the runway. Violence in the passenger cabins. NTSB board members interfering in investigations, and all types of professional training being driven by the inept. Industry leaders are losing touch with their workforce, losing sight of the safety culture, which in response causes negative impacts on the various company objectives documented in their mission statements. I can see the effects of upper management in airlines, overhaul facilities, aviation schools, manufacturing, and many other aviation institutions that public trust is shaken by executive decisions to disregard safety cultures established long ago, to abandon their mission objectives. There are no good reasons, just complacency and/or a failure to care about why safety exists, how safety drives employee welfare, which drives productivity, which drives success. Upper managers have abandoned reason and responsibility. Employees shoulder the blame, and the flying public is losing trust. It all goes back to the fact aviation will suffer on all levels because unqualified people seized responsibility for aviation safety before falling asleep at the switch. And it's long past time to wake up. Hello, I'm Stephen Carbone, and this is By Reason of Air Safety. Welcome to episode 4, the last introductory episode. The purpose of these first 4 episodes was to establish who the major parties were in the aviation industry and why we must analyze aviation safety problems. Episode 1 initiated the podcast By Reason of Air Safety. I introduced myself and where the podcast would take us. In episode 2, I gave a background to the FAA and how their mission to improve and ensure safety is failing to return to the FAA's own mission, mostly because of upper management's own failure to recognize problems. In addition, the adoption of policies like diversity, equity, and inclusion pushed the FAA further off its safety trajectory. The root cause of these safety misdirections was and is politically motivated and by self-serving politicians. Episode 3 provided viewers with a rare yet honest look at the NTSB's effectiveness. How since 1967, the NTSB has been pursuing an undefined and unproductive mistake called probable cause. I was particularly critical of the NTSB only because what I've seen and what I see is as the only investigatory agency dedicated to transportation safety, the NTSB misunderstands their purpose. To be clear, safety is not improved by finding out what probably happened. Safety is improved by knowing exactly what happened. No guesswork is allowed. Now, I'm not a casual observer. I investigated major accidents for the NTSB. I personally watched as aviation experience and knowledge were crushed to push personal agendas. I'm also unsympathetic to NTSB board members who hijack investigations only to use them for their own personal benefit. So there's no mistake. When inexperienced NTSB upper management, like board members, commandeer an investigation, it's only to pad their resumes. Now we're in episode 4, where we will look into the challenges of the aviation industry. We'll spend much of this episode looking at the major commercial aviation industry itself, namely the airlines. Not because the other aviation specialties don't deserve attention, but because what happens in the airline industry affects all aviation in different ways, whether it's new technologies or cultural issues. So my plan is to focus on the source. And finally, Allow me to represent myself again with my qualifications. I worked in the airline industry for 19 years in both operations and airworthiness. I was the only NTSB major accident investigator with airline experience. The only one, mind you, who was qualified to work the aircraft specialties, systems, structures, engines, and aircraft maintenance. And then I was an FAA aviation safety inspector who conducted numerous investigations, oversaw operators, employed root cause analysis in my investigations, and worked with every type of Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations Part certificate holder in the industry. That gives what I bring to this podcast credibility. Abraham Lincoln stated in his 1838 Lyceum address, "If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher." He was talking about Americans in general. He went on to say, "We must live through all time or die by suicide." Now, Lincoln wasn't talking about aviation, obviously, and he wasn't being dramatic. Lincoln was trying to call attention to all of America's internal problems in 1838. What Lincoln said was America could only be destroyed from within, by bad actors and malevolent forces inside America. With aviation lies a similar challenge, that those holding the reins are destroying aviation from inside, such as manufacturing, the airlines, overhaul facilities, those claiming to represent aviation education, regulatory controllers, and accident investigatory agencies. These are the ones who will cause aviation safety to die by suicide. Through selfishness, ignorance, confusion, or intentional sabotage, these are the destructive forces from within. And when this happens, we will have no one to blame but ourselves. For too long, different people have monopolized on when and what gets reported on aviation. It's been mostly inaccurate, emotion-stuffed nonsense. There are the air accident investigation dramatizations, which are nothing more than poorly written, overacted aviation accident screenplays, without a hint of reality. There's the NTSB and other investigatory agencies who forgot how to solve accident investigations. There's the media, who will report anything but the truth concerning aviation safety threats. For instance, when Jeju Flight 2216 crashed in December in 2024 in South Vietnam, the media sensationalized the Boeing 737, pushed the Boeing connection, while ignoring the fact the accident aircraft had rolled out of the Boeing plant in 2009. For days, social media buzzed with anti-Boeing rants, ignoring the fact Boeing had nothing to do with the accident. That fact just didn't agree with media's agenda to sell sensationalism. The media incites anger or complacency in the wrong people, while cultivating ignorance in their audience. They follow the adage, "It is better to beg forgiveness than ask permission." Only the media's misdemeanors aren't about flight delays. Instead, they write about pilot suicide without facts, pretend they have a direct quotes without actually having access to the person being quoted, and interview experts for the drama, no matter whose reputation is damaged, and it's called absence of malice. Then there are the true problems, namely upper managers in some airlines, again, overhaul facilities, manufacturers, pilot training, and other safety critical companies who've been failing fantastically at maintaining any type of safety culture into their workforce. Instead, they bow to the latest whims in personnel recruitment, hiring only those who share an affinity for similar unsafe ideas. This is where safety fails. This is where we die by suicide. Consider the collision over the Potomac. Was the military helicopter's pilot in command, that PIC, qualified to fly a Sikorsky UH-60 military helicopter? Should that helicopter PIC have been in that seat? And if not, why not? Was this a training issue? Was it a political issue? If not, why was that PIC in place at night under an approach path to begin with? What about the Delta 757 that lost a nose tire while taxiing? Didn't a United 777 lose a main tire while taking off out of San Francisco? Weren't two Delta mechanics killed when they tried to disassemble a tire? Question is, why wasn't the tire depressurized before it was even removed from the aircraft's axle? The fact that the tire exploded in the shop meant it could have exploded on the ramp or while in transit to the shop, killing more people. And what the flying public doesn't understand is changing and depressurizing tires are some of the most basic jobs an aircraft technician can perform. Are these three events concerning tire maintenance just indicative of poor training, of poor management, of complacency? Or were they indicative of problems more significant than tires? Think about it. If easy jobs like tire changes are done wrong, can we trust more complicated maintenance as being done right? And what about the Delta Regional Flight 4819 accident in Toronto? Were those pilots intimidated by the digital technologies? Were these pilots qualified to make this approach? Flipping an airliner is a pretty big deal. It's not just about a hard landing. It's about control. Was this a mechanical problem? Did the pilot control the computer? Did this happen due to poor piloting skills, poor pilot training? Or was a pilot promoted to the left seat too soon? To those who understand, these aren't so much accidents, but symptoms of larger industry problems. I mentioned a major accident on the horizon. These are the symptoms I talked about. Yes, these were individual events, but they're evidence of incompetence, poor training. In a nutshell, breakdowns in numerous safety cultures. But they're all proof of how everyday actions like descent rates, checking for traffic, or correctly accomplishing maintenance by established procedures have suddenly become symptoms of some things much worse. But what? And where did it start? My guess is one starting point was the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978, also known as Public Law 95-504. Now stay with me, this will make sense. The Deregulation Act introduced significant industry-altering changes in all of aviation, changes that were never anticipated, consequences that would take years, even decades, to surface. When I was a technician, my fellow mechanics and I often talked about their old days, the ones before deregulation, and we'd argue about the benefits and consequences, but we'd all agree deregulation, whether for good or bad, had earth-shattering impacts on aviation. Now, change is good, but the consequences are often hell. It was obvious in those days that airline industry powerhouses like TWA, Eastern, and Braniff struggled to adapt to a competitive airline industry. No more government subsidies for those guys. Other deregulation changes took place over time, such as the rise of regional airlines, the unforeseen expansion in the number of repair stations, or the evolution of the cargo industry. Each of these changes contributed to more upsets in the aviation industry, from the airlines to the smallest mom-and-pop repair stations, from general aviation to unmanned aerial vehicles. Today, almost 50 years later, all aviation industry participants have been directly or indirectly affected by the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978. What added to the mix was the FAA neither had the resources at the time or the funding to react to deregulation. Industry was hurting, caught off guard. They sure didn't want an alert FAA stepping up their oversight game and surveillance during the hard times, so industry tried staying under the radar. Regional airlines have grown in importance since deregulation. After deregulation, the major airlines were no longer being subsidized by the government to fly into the smaller markets. Yet they saw the promise of those smaller markets opening up to less expensive scheduled airlines like People's Express and AirTran. What to do? Starting out as a Part 135 operators, the regional airline positions changed as lucrative deals with major airlines were made. Regionals originally operated in low-populated areas, like parts of Alaska, with non-regular scheduled flights. But contracts with the major airlines changed that. The majors wanted commitments for scheduled service contracts that favored the majors, not necessarily the regionals. And as many as 8 or 9 regionals were connected to a single major airline, each protective of their own contracts. However, as the regional airlines would soon discover, the financial benefits to the regionals were modest at best. Competitive nature would transfer from being a major airline problem to a regional airline problem. And these regionals, on smaller profits, had to cut costs, taking hits from both operations and airworthiness. For instance, regionals paid their employees far less than the majors, including the pilots, and this made it difficult for regionals to hold employees. Pilots would soon jump to the majors. As a result, the regionals had to constantly hire and train to keep their contracts satisfied. This in itself was a serious safety problem. Then, 90% to 100% of regional airline maintenance was farmed out. As the number of maintenance providers increased, operators lost control of the maintenance performed on their aircraft. Complacency started to settle in. Safety issues took years to reveal themselves. For instance, it would take 8 years for the first regional accident to occur, and when it did, investigators had no idea what they had stumbled onto. Ryanair Service Flight 103 in Homer, Alaska crashed on November 22, 1987. The Ryanair service accident demonstrated operational problems, specifically in load control and weight and balance. The NTSB investigation missed the root causes. Ryanair showed operational troubles, like the pilot's failures to follow company procedures with weight and balance. In addition, NTSB board members started interfering with the Ryanair investigation. Then the Brit Airways Flight 2574 accident demonstrated problems with controlling maintenance. Even though the NTSB found Brit Airways maintenance problems, they failed to pursue the issue any further. They didn't understand that cultural failures at Brit Airways would show up later in other regional airline accidents like Air Midwest. The Air Midwest Flight 5481 accident demonstrated both a lack of operational and maintenance controls. The NTSB investigation missed both operational and maintenance root causes. They found Air Midwest had many maintenance issues, but like Brit Airways, they didn't go far enough with the follow-up investigations into deep cultural problems. In addition, investigators mostly ignored the operational problems that were present in not just Air Midwest, but the other sister regional airlines in contract with U.S. Airways. Then there was the Colgan Flight 9446 accident that demonstrated a complete loss of maintenance controls and major issues in operations. Colgan had serious maintenance discrepancies, again, not properly pursued by the NTSB. But more serious was that Colgan's culture allowed the pilots to ignore safety issues brought to their attention prior to the flight, issues the pilots should have challenged. Then 9 years later, the Colgan Flight 3407 accident demonstrated operational control issues the NTSB couldn't recognize. These issues were lost in the political circus following the investigation, namely Colgan's internal problems. The NTSB had very little exposure to differences between regional airlines and major airlines, namely that Colgan's pilots' salaries didn't match its domicile economic realities. The political circus centered on the ineffective FAA Reauthorization Act of 2010 that of all ineffective safety measures gave safety responsibilities to the NTSB, the least qualified agency to be responsible for anything. Now, other regional accidents, most Part 135, were a direct result of the Deregulation Act of 1978, but we won't address those here. We will look at them in other podcasts. In the wake of Deregulation Act, low-cost airlines such as People's Express, Transair, and ValueJet made their appearances when the act made it easier for new airlines to enter service. These startup airlines made the competitive market harder by challenging the legacy airlines to fare wars that further hurt the legacy airlines' profits and survival. Low-cost airlines changed the dynamic of air travel. Passengers traded luggage for backpacks, comfortable seating for cattle cars, meals for pretzels. Low-cost airlines discouraged dress casual for denim shorts and concert t-shirts. Airlines didn't do away with spacious seating and free check-in because they wanted to. They did it because they had to stay competitive. People's Express merged with Continental later on, while AirTran merged with Southwest Airlines, who, by the way, was another more successful low-cost airline. But ValueJet made headlines when ValueJet Flight 592 crashed shortly after taking off from Miami. The NTSB investigation into ValueJet's 592 resulted in an accident report full of speculation and hearsay. The report showed investigators failed to understand the intent of the federal aviation regulations, specifically Title 14 CFR Section 25.857. But most importantly, the NTSB missed a golden opportunity to do what they're supposed to do, to make the FAA more effective. Accident reports are not just about assigning blame, but to analyze the situation and introduce solutions. So instead of accusing the FAA of failure, it was the NTSB's responsibility to recognize the FAA's limited resources, to help the FAA succeed in their safety mission. The NTSB should have pushed Congress to stop hobbling the FAA with political games like the continuing resolution. The NTSB should have publicly tasked Congress to increase the FAA's budget to strengthen safety. Before deregulation, shipping by air was largely limited to supplemental operators, or the post office shipping on passenger airlines. Overnight shipping arrived 5 years before deregulation in a limited way. Although overnight cargo accidents were years away, overnight air freight presented the FAA with unique problems. Airlines like FedEx, UPS, Airborne, Emory, Burlington International, and DHL operated mostly overnight between the hours of 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. in the morning, while the FAA, as rigid as any government agency is with overtime, worked 8 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Monday through Friday. Overnight shipping introduced a new complexity: hazardous shipping. Labeled as will not carry, passenger airliners like ValueJet were not allowed to carry hazardous materials, which is regulated under Title 49. Cargo aircraft had no such restrictions and made hazardous shipping a new hurdle to overcome. Cargo operators only had their pilots and aircraft in the home base between, again, the hours of 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. in the morning. But during the daytime hours, when the FAA was in the office, cargo airliners were out in the various field airports with their pilots. This made operational oversight and surveillance difficult for FAA inspectors. And finally, cargo aviation safety was becoming obvious, with accidents like when Fine Air Flight 101 skidded across 36th Street in Miami, and Emory Flight 11 cartwheeled into a car lot in Sacramento. The NTSB didn't exhibit much energy or effort in these investigations. Contracting played a large role in both disasters. With Fine Air, it was contract load crews, and Emory, it was contract maintenance. And when Atlas Air Flight 3591 crashed 20 years later, its NTSB investigation took a back seat to the B-737 MAX accidents that had occurred in Indonesia and Ethiopia. Cargo airline accidents would continue to receive little attention. Directly because of deregulation, the major airlines, the low-cost upstarts, and the cargo operators looked to cut more costs. Maintenance, the necessary evil of airlines, was proving to be the air operators' headache. To fill the void and reduce unnecessary costs, airlines and other air operators turned to repair stations and maintenance providers to take up to 90% of their maintenance. Repair stations have been certificated since 1937, but they received their greatest boost in numbers following deregulation. Contracting maintenance meant the air operators of all sizes could transfer costs to these repair stations and maintenance providers, and without the FAA knowing, most responsibility for following the air operator's maintenance program. It turned into a logistical dream for the operators and a logistical nightmare for the maintenance providers. But contracting placed the air operator's aircraft in a yet unrealized hotspot, which was the ability for airlines and repair stations to provide less than quality work. For instance, Emory Flight 17, Air Midwest 5481, Colgan 9446, and other accidents drove FAA inspectors to identify procedural and quality assurance disconnects between the FAA, the airlines, and the maintenance providers. Maintenance was being dropped while changes to FAA-accepted programs were just being ignored. Mergers in a regulated industry, like Delta and Northeast Airlines, were rare and far different than those that came as a result of deregulation's influence. Remember, the airlines had free money in government subsidies before deregulation. As the futility of surviving in a post-deregulation aviation industry, airlines had three choices. 1. Succeed. Pull out all the stops and do what was necessary to claw their way through the economy as it went through roller coaster type recoveries and inflation. 2. Fold up and shut the doors. Give up and park the airplanes. And 3. Merge. Many airlines joined forces, merging into one airline: Pan Am and National, Eastern and Texas Air, FedEx and Flying Tiger. This had positive and negative outcomes. The merging of airlines was no small matter. Of all the changes airlines went through during post-deregulation, I felt mergers were the most catastrophic. Why is that? Because mergers were life-changing. They could even affect a city the airline was based in. Pilots, flight attendants, and aircraft technicians were heavily impacted. The way airlines merged affected domicile assignments, where employees would live, or even if one would have a job. Seniority lists were also merged. They affected pay, overtime pay, equipment flown, equipment worked on, upgrades, downgrades, routes flown, shift differential, job availability, domicile choices, and road trips. Unions became involved, not necessarily in a good way. Management and workforce interactions were stressful enough, but unions could fan the flames. If the merging airlines shared the same union or had different unions, that also added to the heartburn. But most importantly, cultures were hard to shuffle from two or more airlines into one. Mergers often sparked hostile takeovers, union busting, or the liquidation of the weaker airline for things like established routes. Some airline mergers were less provocative, but no merger took place without collateral damage that also affected the safety culture. Because mergers were adversarial. Some created more hostile work environments than others, but no one escaped unscathed. Hostilities were problematic in an airplane cabin's limited space, but even more so in the tight confines of the cockpit, making even normal communications a safety issue. When considering the industry, mergers were emotional roller coasters for workers whose careers centered around the airline being merged. If affected, how experienced trade people left the sinking ship to move on to other airlines or left aviation altogether. Upper management, however, never felt the impacts of mergers. Unprotected, the workforce lost retirement, pay scale, seniority, job security, long-earned promotions, homes, and ways of life. Then there were the changes not associated with deregulation, such as digital technology. How many problems rose out of the glass cockpit? Two-man cockpits instead of three-man cockpits. Fly-by-wire instead of cable-driven systems. Twin-engine airliners called ETOPS that fly direct routes overseas that can allow aircraft to fly up to 5 hours from land on one engine. For those who worked on analog airliners, the digital cockpit was strange and unnerving. The newer avionics were very sensitive to static discharge, for instance. Pilots and mechanics were used to tangible information, a physical connection between the yoke and the flight control. They had experience with airliners that responded to commands, not gave them. How well did operators, or do operators today, understand the limitations of an airliner that thinks for itself? Are we giving artificial intelligence too much power? Does the computer communicate problems to the pilot or to the maintenance technician? Have we lost track of pilot-to-innovation issues like those found in Air France Flight 447, Lion Air 610, or Ethiopian Airlines 302? Digital technology is still misunderstood to a great degree. We don't know the extent of its safety issues because no one has conducted a proper investigation into the effects of digital control. Technology isn't dangerous, but a total dependence on technology is. As we saw with Air France 447, Lion Air 610, or Ethiopian Airlines 302, when flight crews and maintenance technicians surrendered their experience and knowledge to a computer, they surrender their ability to control a safe outcome. They no longer babysit the airliner, they are subjected to the airliner's decisions. Using Ethiopian Airlines and Lion Air's 737 MAX accidents, it is easy to see how dependence on the technology to save money stripped away a pilot's ability to choose a safer course. We've heard Boeing was to blame for both accidents, but there were several arguments against Ethiopian Airlines and Lion Air themselves. For one, Boeing delivered the MAX with the technology that the two airlines, Ethiopian Airlines and Lion Air, requested and paid for. The fuel savings and the digital technology that allowed the airplane to fly itself was in response to both airlines' purchase requirements. Caveat emptor, the buyer must beware. Be careful what one asks for, they just might get it. That's not a flippant statement. Both airlines should have been better prepared for what they bought. 2. The responsibility to train the pilots to recognize unsafe situations was the operators' responsibilities, namely Ethiopian Airlines and Lion Air's responsibilities. Did any of those who investigated the accidents analyze the pilot and maintenance training programs? Were the pilots properly trained to handle the new technology? We never saw this happen in the United States. 3. After reading both accident reports, it was clear there was no mention at all of either airline calling Boeing with questions about the MAX that occurred before the accidents in response to other problems with the pitot system. Boeing does respond to requests for both operational and technical assistance. All manufacturers are responsible for answering questions and offering assistance with old and new technologies. And 4, the last issue. Did either report mention if the pilots tried to return to the departure airport when trouble started? Or did they just keep flying on to the destination airport and hope that things would get better? Pilot training should have ensured the pilots shouldn't engage in troubleshooting, but instead land at the nearest airfield with an unsafe airplane. When I conducted FAA en route inspections, I once asked the captain about the new technologies. This captain was a highly experienced pilot with thousands of flight hours. He conveyed a general distrust and ambivalence for the computer that was crippling his skills and experience. As an aircraft technician having worked on digital technology, I understood. Technology was erasing our technical skills, such as troubleshooting capabilities. Both operations and maintenance are surrendering to digital technologies. Their skills, experience, and knowledge are being corrupted by company policies that dictate the computer fly and the computer fix the aircraft, not the pilots or the technicians. And it's getting worse as calls for single pilot cockpits are becoming a reality, yet in the development stage. Increasing technologies and biodegradable fuels are being driven by special interests. But are these new biofuels being tested correctly? Are consequences being documented or just the victories? Improper vetting could lead to accidents. So are these new improvements being vetted with complete data? Are airlines that fly ETOPS going to have to recertify their ETOPS if they use a different type of fuel? What about unmanned aerial vehicles, also known as UAVs? There have been studies that looked at tracking UAVs around the city areas. Manned aircraft, like police helicopters, operate and can be tracked inside a city. But with UAVs, proprietary frequency issues and city building interference were two of the problems with tracking UAVs in certain places. The placement of tracking devices on private property also caused problems, and these problems will eventually be overcome. But until then, what is to be done? What will the fixes lead to? As new technologies and products are introduced, are pilots and technicians receiving adequate training? Do they know how to override the aircraft, to outthink the aircraft? Will they recognize faults in the aircraft technologies? ValueJet's 592's ramp crews ignored their training, which led to a major accident. The ValueJet ramp crews loaded hazardous materials in cargo bays where they did not belong. The cargo crews failed to restrain aircraft tires that initiated the fires in the cargo bay. Did airlines learn to properly train the operations people? Years later, the Air Midwest 5481 and National Air Cargo 101 accidents were the result of poor cargo training. Is this still a problem? Are contractors loading international flights improperly trained? And who ensures they are? Training in industry and government has developed into a useless mess. Since COVID, virtual training has replaced quality training everywhere, including in the government regulatory agencies. The other aviation industries affected by these accidents and technologies aren't limited to airlines. They are found in every corner of the aviation industry and are affected by the safety failures that are seen at the airline level. Emergency medical services, public use, corporate, crop dusting, unmanned aerial vehicles, charters, and others are affected by the dangers not being discovered by improper accident investigations accomplished by unqualified accident investigators. How has the misreading of public crises affected the future of aviation? For instance, forcing pilots and flight attendants to be inoculated against COVID didn't create healthier crew members. Instead, it forced programs like Vaccinate or Be Fired, and other failed programs that have weakened the aviation industry, ridding it of the experienced. The vaccinations left the industry with vaccine injured and many unemployed who could be the answers to aviation's present problems. Solutions aren't going to be quick in coming, which is why any delays will prolong industry's restoration. The solutions are there, it's just we've become so set in our ways it's going to be painful. And yet nothing worth having isn't worth the sacrifice. For one, get rid of the bureaucratic control. Do it slowly but effectively. And the politicians with their weepy calls for justice, concentrate on your jobs of voting for intelligent budgets. We don't want to see you on Bill Maher or The View. We want you in your seats working towards the welfare of the American people. 2, stop putting people who caused aviation's problems into positions of power. They're the reasons things are backwards. So why are you rewarding them by giving them more opportunities to mess up aviation? 3, return government agencies to their purpose. The FAA, to regulate with knowledge, experience, and proper training. The NTSB, to investigate with knowledge, experience, and proper training. Oh, and get the 5 board members out of the investigations. And 4, throttle back. Learn the technology. Let the technology work for us, not us work for the technology. These are all starting points. There's so much more to do in time. So let's get back to why we got into aviation to begin with. We have to relearn how to walk before we can learn to fly. Now, as we move forward with this podcast, we will be looking deeply into the accidents mentioned here and many others. And I hope you join me. It will prove to be an informative ride. And until next time, I'm Stephen Carbone reminding you to tab. Think safe, act safe, be safe. Take care of yourselves.